huge disclaimer. If any of these do exist in a relationship, it's not like a wave off, don't marry them, right? It's not like saying you can't get married. It's just saying like, these are things that you should be aware of, like may not seem like a big deal, but can be a big deal one day. So there are a number of issues that might exist in dating or exist in engagement that you talk to couples and they're like, oh no, that's probably not going to be a big deal. Like that we both understand what's going on here. We both are on the same page on this issue. But then after marriage, they become more and more of a big deal. Does that make sense? Like they can get to the point where they can cause a lot of conflict, a lot of trouble in marriage years down the road, even though while you're dating, while you're engaged, they don't really seem like they're going to be an issue. And that's because as you go through marriage, things are going to change. Things might get more stressful. Having a bunch of kids around the house might be more difficult, wherever your relationship is at, the trials and the difficulties of marriage are going to strain that a little bit. And so you want to have a really strong relationship so that it can stand up to those trials no problem, In fact, sometimes those trials can even strengthen even more. But these things, these handful of things we're going to talk about today, are things that can exist that are maybe slight friction points now that might turn into larger friction points later. Does that make sense? Number one is something called disparity of cult / mixed marriages, right? So it's a big word. It's a canon law word. What that means is if you're in a relationship with somebody else, if you get married to somebody else, but you have two different religions, right? Or two different denominations. Maybe you're both Christian, but one of you is Catholic and the other one is Southern Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or something like that. Or maybe you're Catholic and somebody else is Jewish, Muslim, or something else. And we like the idea, and rightfully so, of love being able to transcend sort of sectarian denominational differences, right? The point is that early in a relationship, it might be much easier to be able to coexist in sort of different spheres of understanding as far as religion goes, as far as denomination goes. A relationship like that can actually be incredibly fruitful in helping us to understand and kind of pursue our own religious background and understand our own beliefs when we have those kind of mutually respectful conversations about what we believe, right? But here's the point, is sometimes after marriage, or even maybe kind of approaching marriage, those things can kind of be exacerbated by different decisions you have to make, right? So you're Catholic and the other person's Southern Baptist, right? What happens when you start having the conversation about what kind of marriage ceremony you're going to have? And maybe you agree about that, but what happens when their spouse says, well, I can't believe that you would have a Catholic wedding. After all the Catholics did to your dear grandmother or something like that, right? Or your great-grandmother is greatly offended that you're not getting married in her church, right? Or you guys may know, as Catholics, if we believe that the Catholic faith is true, if we're convinced that this is the truth, there's actually, if you're getting married to somebody who's not a Catholic, you have to commit to the fact that you are intending to raise your children in the Catholic faith, right? What happens if your spouse doesn't quite agree with that commitment? What happens if even all of that gets settled just fine, and then after marriage, the decision comes of well, are we going to take the kids to your service or our service? Are we going to split them back and forth? Because even that's kind of sketchy. What happens when your kids first start asking, why is it that you guys believe different things? What is the truth? And you kind of have to have a conversation about the fact that you believe different things, What happens when the question comes up of are we going to send the kids to Catholic school, or are we going to send them to public school or Baptist school? What happens if one or the other of you suddenly wants to dive way deeper in your faith, and suddenly you start seeing points of conflict that you didn't see before, and like that causes more friction within the family and even maybe amongst your kids. What happens when Lent rolls around and mom is like drinking chocolate milk and eating cookies and dad is fasting on Fridays, you know? What if mom's eating a nice steak filet mignon on Fridays and dad's eating his fish, right? You know, like what happens if somebody's Muslim and one person's Catholic and one person's observing Ramadan, the other one person's observing Lent? Like, are the kids observing both? Are they doing them back to back? You know, like, what are you going to tell your children, like, as you continue to grow as a family about what you believe, right? And even now, you might be saying like, well, that feels like things that we can work out, but and it could well be. But having spoken to a lot of couples who have gone down that journey of coming from different faith traditions, like I've spoken to very few. I have spoken to them, but I've spoken to very few who like have crushed, like we landed this in a really good way where we're both able to practice our faiths in a way that they don't seem to be in conflict with each other at all. Does that make sense? Like fundamentally, what religion is, it's the answers to the most important questions in life. Like we believe that God has given us these answers, and other people believe that there are different answers to the most important questions of life, right? And that's totally okay, and we can respect that fact. But like, how easy or difficult is it going to be to get along in a family if that family all has radically different ideas, different answers to the most important questions in life? What happens when your kids ask you the most important questions in life? How are you going to answer them? And are you going to be cool with your spouse giving a different answer?
One of the other things that we talked about when we were discussing whether or not things that can seem small at the beginning and then loom large later is life goals. Have you talked about what you want out of life? As opportunities come along in your life, which may not be happening while you're dating or engaged, but might happen later, the question then comes, what are you willing to sacrifice for that? There are questions that you can begin to ask yourself of like, where are you going to live? What kind of house are you going to have? Are you going to have a big house or a small house? Do you want to have one of those little tiny houses? Do you want to live out in the country? Do you want to live in a rural community? Do you want to live in an urban? Even if you do want to live in an urban community, what kind of urban community? Do you want to live in something like Dayton, in which it's relatively a small city, considering the US? Or do you want to live in an urban city like New York, in which you can't see the sky at night because it's always lit up? Are you going to raise your kids with access to certain things, whether that be sports, whether you like to go to the lake every single summer, or whether or not you want to be home all the time or not be home all the time, or even what does the concept of being home mean? Travel, both for job and leisure, or is it worth the sacrifice to go and visit family on a regular basis? And then also, as well, occupational aspirations. To describe to your future spouse, what is your perfect job? Maybe not like, oh, it's I want to be a space cowboy. Be like, that's not a thing. Not yet. But with a perfect job, it could just simply be like, hey, let me describe for you what I would ideally love to do. And if that changes over the course of the relationship, share that too. Of like, oh, hey, I'd really like to do this, this, and this, and this. Maybe that job doesn't exist yet, but I would like to do this, this, and this. And so they understand what are the things that really make you come alive. And so another aspect that can really throw a wrench in things is our relationship with our in-laws. Examples might be that you're expecting to go to your family for dinner once a week, but your spouse only sees their family a few times a year, or they might be frustrated or at least not used to seeing family so often. Or the idea of one person anticipates relying heavily on the grandparents to watch the kids, but then maybe the other person doesn't. Or maybe they're like, yeah, I would really love for your mom and dad to watch the kids, but I really don't like how they watch the kids. There's all sorts of different things like that. So it's about managing expectations about the things that can change over time. A real world example of how that kind of even evolves is the question of where do you spend holidays? And so Jamie and I as we were married is at first, the first couple of years of marriage, we were trading off who would go to Christmas and Thanksgiving, because those are the two major holidays that families get together. So we would basically being like, okay, well, we spent Thanksgiving this year with her parents, so we'll spend Christmas with my parents, and then next year we'll flip-flop, and then flip-flop, and then flip-flop. And then it got to the point in which we were like, it's fine, it's good, we kind of like that, but it was also getting exhausting because we were having more kids. And then there was also that semblance of, at some point we needed to cut the cord, and like, when do we start our family traditions? When do we start our, like, in one sense, there always is that transition from, okay, this is the family, but now you have smaller families and they create units and all sorts of beautiful and wonderful things. And so Jamie and I then shifted and we said, like, well, we're not traveling anywhere for Christmas. We're going to do Christmas here, wherever we live. And so we would start our own traditions with Christmas. And then it was more like, oh, the day after Christmas? Yeah, sure. We can go, and we actually now try to see both families during Christmas vacation, which, working this job, it's easier because you guys are off for a month. So it's easy to make that work. But when I was working at a parish, it was really hard to do that. Because it's like, no, you work up until Christmas. You get Christmas Eve and Christmas Day off, but that's about it. So with that, and with that understanding, it doesn't mean that there is one way or another way that has to be right or wrong. It's just coming from the idea of like, have you guys talked about it? Have you guys figured it out? Are you on the same page about how that's going to work? And there's not a, like, even with Jamie and I and how we did arranging how we did holidays, like, there's a certain point in which you have to be like, all right, well, I don't know if this is the best way, but this is what we're going to decide. And as long as you're deciding together, and back to the issue of resentment, you actually agree, you're not agreeing to something that you don't actually believe, then you're okay. You're in the clear.
We're talking about, like, these are issues that don't seem like a big deal, but could be a big deal later, right? One of those with in-laws is that sometimes we marry somebody that has parents who are different maybe than what the relationship desires or is good for the relationship, right? For instance, maybe one or the other of you has parents that are incredibly manipulative or incredibly controlling. We're just used to having a lot more control than you would really want, right? Maybe you've got parents who are just kind of mean for some reason or the other. Maybe you've got parents who don't think that the two of you should get married. Like, all of that can happen from time to time. And as you walk into that sort of marriage, that sort of situation, you might both agree, well, I think we should get married. You might both agree, well, your parents are a little bit controlling. You might both agree, well, your parents are a little bit manipulative, you know? You might be of totally the same mind when it comes to how crazy the other person's parents are, right? And you could both walk into marriage aware of that situation. And you muscle your way through the wedding and all the difficulty of that, and then you think, all right, but now we're on our own, we're free, right? But it gets difficult later on the road when you have to answer a lot more questions about what role do our parents have in our lives now. For instance, like, are you going to invite the parents to, like, your child's baptism? Are you going to invite the parents to come babysit the child, right? Are you going to, if they come to you and have a whole lot of advice about how to raise your kids, like, do you agree about how that advice should be listened to? If one parent, if there's a relationship where the parents are very controlling of one or the other of you, like, as they get more invested in your relationship, like when you have kids, when you live closer or farther away, like, what happens when those anxieties and sort of involvements ratchet up? Like, what happens if later on in the relationship you guys have a fight and the thought comes back, like, my parents told me I never should have married you, you know? Like, even though you're of the same mindset walking into the relationship, there are a lot of things that might get more and more intense, like especially as children come into the equation, especially as children's come into the family. Children's. So like, it's not saying you can't marry somebody based on how their parents treat the relationship. It's just kind of like, it's something to walk into a relationship with the mindset of like, we need to be clear, you and I, about like what role my parents or your parents will have in raising the kids, especially if you know that conflict already exists.